So we're up the very end of Pei Testament Bays. We're up to, it's mamish towards the end of Mi Matzos. Just to review, the Mishnah had said that the Isser of Gidanasha applies b'chulin u'mikdashim, that it applies by karbanis as well. So the Gemara says, why wouldn't it? Just because you have an animal that has an Isser Gidanasha and then you make it a karban, the Isser Gidanasha should go away? So the Gemara had first said, maybe it means like this. Maybe it means that if you hold that Gidin have tam, so there's an Isser Me'ila of eating it. So the animal starts off as a regular animal, there's an Isser Gidanasha. But then when you're Magdish it, the Isser of Kodshim is Chal on the Isser Gidanasha as well. So you have two Issurim. Maybe that's the point of the Mishnah. The problem is, the Gemara says, our Tana must hold Ein Begidim Neis and Tam. So the Gemara says, okay. But then, so maybe it means that there's only an Isser Gidanasha, not an Isser Karban on the Gidanasha itself of a Karban. But then the Gemara says, but that can't be because the next Mishnah feels there is Tam by Gidin. So the Gemara says, rather it must be talking about a Vlad, meaning that normally, that the cases where you have a baby of a Karban, and it's growing in the mother's womb, and as it's developing, the Isser of Gidanasha is Chal when it's in utero. The Kedusha is Chal when it's in utero, and they're happening at the same time. So because they're happening at the same time, both are Chal. Because there's a discussion throughout Shas of Isser Chal Lisser, Ein Isser Chal Lisser. But over here, because they're happening at the same time, then the Isser is together. So now the Gemara is going to question this presumption that both Isurim happen at the same time. That in utero, it has at the moment that it has the Kedusha is the moment that the Gid is Chal. Because the Gemara is going to point out, Pashtus, it has Kedusha once the limbs are formed, even before the sinews are created. So L'chora, you can't tell me they're at the same time. Rather, it must be the Kedusha's Chal first. So then why is the Isser Gidanasha Chal? Ein Isser Chal al Isser. Umi Matzos Amrit Tervayu Bahadi Adadi Kasi. Is it possible to say that both Yisurim are Chal at the same time? Generally, we assume that the limbs are formed before the sinews, and the limbs already have Kedusha. So the Isser of Karbanos should be Chal before Gidanasha, and therefore the Isser Gidanasha should not be Chal, because Ein Isser Chal al Isser. You see, if it was the reverse, I could argue that the Isser of Karban would be Chal on the Isser of Gidanasha, because there's a rule of Ein Isser Chal Isser, but the Isser of Karbanos are more severe. And therefore, usually the second Isser being more severe is a reason for it to be Chal. But if we're going to argue that the Karban is developing first, before the sinews, then why is the Isser of Gidanasha Chal, Ein Isser Chal Isser? Says the Gemara of Atzanan, Al Elu Tumas HaNazir Megaleach, these are the following tumas that cause a Nazir to lose his Nazirus. In other words, these are real tumas. Al Ames, touching a dead body, Val Kazayas Min Ames, or touching a Kazayas of a dead body. There's an obvious question. Once you tell me that a kazayas of a dead body is metama, of course the entire dead body. Why do you need both? The kashalon, and we ask, al kazayas min ames megaleach al kulei kol shekain. If you're already tame by a kazayas of a dead body, kal v'chomer you're tame by touching an entire dead body. So it says the Gemara of Amr Rav Yechon. Rav Yechon explains that le nitzacha el nefel shel niksheru evar of begidim. The case is as follows. When it says the case of a whole body is not a whole developed body of an adult. Of course, if a kazayas is metama kavachomer an entire body, the case is where the entire body is not a kazayas. How so? It's talking about a nefel, an aborted fetus, shalinikshru evar begidin, that it's the entire fetus, and there's the outline of a body, but it's not a kazayas yet, and it doesn't even have sinews, so it doesn't have gidin to hold it together. So what the Brisa means is, the Mishnah means is, a Nazir becomes Tameh either by touching a kazayas of a dead body, or even if it's less than a kazayas, but it's the entire fetus. What do you see from this? You see that the limbs are formed before the sinews. So too, for our discussion, if the limb of the animals are formed inside utero, first, that means it's already Kaddish with the Kedusha of a Karban, before the Gidin are Chal. So why is the Isser Gid Chal, Ein Isser Chal Isser? Alma Isser Mukdashim Kadin. So says the Gemara, Af Agav the Isser Mukdashim Kadin. You're right. really the karbanos are chal first. And yet the Isser of Gid Anosha is also chal. Why? Asi Isser Gid chal alayu. The Gid Anosha prohibition also is chal. What about Ein Isser chal Isser? Gid Anosha is very severe. Why? Shekid Isser noig b'nei noyach. Gid Anosha applies to Jews and to Goyim alike. So because it applies to the entire world, it's a very expansive Isser, and therefore we say Isser chal Isser in this situation. Now this svara, that the Isser Gid Anosha is chal on another Isser because it applies to Goyim, Man Shamalei Hai Svara, who is the one who said that svara? Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who said that svara, because there's a discussion later on in the Masechta, in about 10 days, there's a machlokes of whether the Isser Gid Anosha applies to non-kosher animals, and it's a fundamental shaila of the non-kosher animal develops before the Gid Anosha. So the Isser of non-kosher begins first, and the question is whether Isser of Gid Anosha is chal unless he chazer. Rabbi Yehuda says yes. Why? Because Isser chal Isser. Why is Isser chal Isser? Because the Gid Anosha is very severe because it applies to Goyim. In other words, this svara was said by Rabbi Yehuda. The problem is, and we're saying that svara in our Mishnah as well, the problem is our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. Hamasisan to like Rabbi Yehuda, our Mishnah is mafurish not like Rabbi Yehuda diktani, because our Mishnah says noig b'behem machai b'yersha yamin b'yersha small. Our Mishnah says that the Isser Gid Anosha applies to the right and to the left flank of the animal. The problem is Rabbi Yehuda's shita is that it only applies to one flank, and it's the right side pashtus. So the point is, how could you say this svara that the Isser Karbon, that the Isser Gid Anosha is chal on karbanos? Because it's an Isser, it's a very big Isser, because it applies to Goyim, and therefore we say Isser chal Isser, and that's the pshat of the Mishnah. The problem is the one who authored that svara was Rabbi Yehuda, and our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. So says the Gemara, Haitana Savar Lekavasi B'chada Palaga B'chada. You're right. Our Mishnah is not Rabbi Yehuda, but our Mishnah, the author of our Mishnah, agrees with Rabbi Yehuda by the Isser chal Isser component, but he disagrees with him regarding how many sides the Gid Anosha applies to. Rabbi Yehuda says just the right side, and our Mishnah holds it applies to both sides. Now, this whole premise that we're saying right now is that Rabbi Yehuda is the author. Rabbi Yehuda's argument applies. Now, what was Rabbi Yehuda's argument again? That the Isser of Gid Anosha is chal on a non-kosher animal, on chazer, because it's an Isser chal Isser. Why? Because it's an Isser kolel. It applies to Goyim as well, so therefore it's a very expansive Isser, and therefore it's chal even on non-kosher animals. So we're extending that to, it will also be chal on karbonos. In Isser chal Isser, it's an Isser kolel. Says the Gemara, who says that you could do that? Just because Rabbi Yehuda said that the Isser Gid Anosha is chal on chazer, who's to say that you could argue that it would be chal on a carbon as well? Maybe it's only chal on chazer because it's just a lav. It's not a very strong Isser, so the second Isser could overlap it. But when the first Isser is not chazer, it's a carbon, which has potential Isser kares. Who says that we say Isser chal Isser in such a situation? Eimer the Shamel Rabbi Yehuda b'Tzemeya the Isser Lav Kotship the Isser Kares Mishamelei. Who said that Rabbi Yehuda's svara would apply to karbonos as well? So maybe you can't say this. So this entire argument of what does the Mishnah mean that the Isser of Gid Anosha is chal on a carbon? So we're saying it means that the Isser of Gid Anosha is chal even on karbonos because Isser chal Isser, and it's Rabbi Yehuda's svara. Who said Rabbi Yehuda would argue that when it comes to a carbon? So rather, the Gemara says, Elahacha b'machberes askinon. Therefore, the Gemara says, really, the Gid Anosha, really, you could say, the whole problem is that the carbon is kaddish in the womb, and then the Gid Anosha develops. So it's a question of Isser chal Isser. So the Gemara says, no, we're talking about a Bechar. And when does the kedusha of the Bechar chal? When it's born. So the Isser Gid Anosha actually comes first. So it's not that it's carbon and then the Gid Anosha is chal, but rather it becomes kaddish only when it's born, when it emerges from the womb, and at that point it already has a Gid Anosha. So it starts off as an Isser Gid Anosha, then the karbanos are chal on top of the Isser Gid Anosha. Says the Gemara, or Iba Yisema, or if you want to say, and by the way, according to this answer, it's dafka b'char, because other karbanos are kaddish b'recha, but it's a b'char that it's dafka kaddish when it's born. Iba Yisema, or v'lad sheis kadshim havyaset he kadashim. Or perhaps it could apply to all karbanos that are pregnant if he believes, if the Tan of our Mishnah believes, that the kedusha is chal only when it's born, not when it's in utero. And therefore, because the kedusha is chal when it's born, at that point, the Gid Anosha was already chal. But, okay. All right. Now, so we're saying in our Mishnah that there's an Isser Gin Anosha on Karbanos. Rav Chi bar Yosef, lo shanu ela kodshim anecholim. This is only true by Karbanos that are eaten, like a Shlomim, Aval kodshim she'ein necholim, but an Ola, whose meat is not eaten, but it's entirely burnt on the Mizbeach, ein Isser Gin Anoig behem. There is no Isser Gin Anosha. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean you could eat the Gin Anosha of an Oila, but he's saying that an Oila is different. Rav Yochanan Amar, Echad Kodshim Necholim, Echad Kodshim She'ein Necholim, Isser Gin Anoig behem. Rav Yochanan says, no, the Oila is no different. So there seems to be a machlokes between Rav Chi bar Yosef and Rav Yochanan regarding the Oila. Now, what is the machlokes? What are they referring to? So, Rav Papa, Loi Pligi, Rav Papa says no machlokes. Each one is referring to a different concept. Kad lahal koisai. Rav Yochanan, who says that the Isser of Gin Anosha applies to an Oila, is universally accepted, and that's referring to the Isser of eating it. Both agree you're not allowed to eat the Gin Anosha of an Oila. Okay? And Kad lahal loisai. But when Rav Chi bar Yosef said the Gin Anosha does not apply, he was referring to burning it on the Mizbeach. In other words, you are allowed to burn it on the Mizbeach. Don't think that because the Gin Anosha is not allowed to be eaten, it's not allowed to be burnt on the Mizbeach as well. Kamashman, it's allowed. So Rav Chi bar Yosef, who said the Gin Anosha does not apply, what he means is don't think of the Gin Anosha as different. You can burn it on the Mizbeach. When Rav Yochanan said that the Isser Gin Anosha does apply, he means you're not allowed to eat it. So everyone agrees you're not allowed to eat it, but everyone agrees you're allowed to burn it on the Mizbeach. Okay, that's the first version. Ikad Amri. Some say Amar Rav Papa kad l'choltzoi, kad l'haloisoi. That when Rav Yochanan said that it's usher to eat the Gin Anosha, what he means is like this: l'choltzoi. Everyone agrees you're not obligated to remove the Gin Anosha from the thigh before you burn it on the mizbech. You're allowed to burn it in a part of the thigh, but if it was removed from the thigh, lahaloisai, then everyone agrees you're not allowed to burn it once it's removed. So in other words, they both agree, and they're both talking about burning on the mizbeach. One says you do burn, one says you don't burn. The answer is they both agree. If it's part of the thigh, you didn't remove it, then burn it as part of the thigh. Once you removed it, for whatever reason, if you removed it, you're not allowed to burn it on the mizbeach. Because it really has to do with the shaila of whether the fact that it's asur for Jews to eat, does that mean it's sort of asur kaviyachol for the mizbeach to eat it? He's saying if it's removed, then you don't burn it on the mizbeach. And Rabbi Yitzchak Amar lahaloy simply. Rabbi Yitzchak says no. They are arguing: do you burn it on the mizbeach? Forget about it was removed, not removed. Are you allowed to burn it on the mizbeach as part of the thigh? Rabbi Yochanan says yes. Rabbi Chi bar Yosef says no. So you have over here a machlokes, according to the last version. It's a machlokes of are you allowed to burn the Gin Anosha of the oil on the mizbech? The Tanya. The truth is, this is a machlokes tanoim. The Tanya, as the Brisa says, now it's a long Brisa, but we'll explain the end of the Brisa. It'll become clear on Amid Beis that it has to do with the Gin Anosha. The Tanya. Hikter hakoyin is a kol hamizbecha. The pasuk says that you burn the entire oil on the mizbech. What does that include? L'rabas hatzamos, hagidim, hakarnayim, hatzlafim. It means you burn the bones, the sinews, the hooves, and the horns of the oil. Yachal afir pirshu. You might think that, let's say they were separated. Let's say the hooves were cut off. You might think that you should put them on the mizbeach. Tamalim rava asisa lesecha habasav adam. So the pasuk says you only burn the meat and the blood, which excludes the hooves, the horns, and the sinews. Now, if you just have the basar v'adam, again, you basically have like this. You have the word basar v'adam implies no hooves, but it says hikter akainis akol, which imply hooves. So the explanation basically is, if they're a part of the animal, if they're still connected, burn it. If they're separated, don't burn it. Okay, so how do you reconcile these two psukim? If the hooves, the horns, the sinews are still attached to the body, you burn it. Parshu, but if they were removed for whatever reason, if they're removed, then even if they're on top of the mizbeach, you take them down. So according to the opinion, this Brisa says, whether hooves or horns or gids, sinews, whatever, of the oil, are they burnt? It depends. If they're still attached, you burn them. If they're severed for whatever reason, then you take them down. It says the Gemara, Uman Tana de Shamet Davar Pirsha Yerdu. Who is the author of this brisa that says that if these items are removed from the animal, you're not allowed to burn it? Rabbi, it's Rabbi. The Tanya, as we'll see in a moment, this brisa brings down the first opinion. Tanakama disagrees. Tanakama says that even if they're separated, you're allowed to burn on the mizbech. The Tanya. Hikter akoinis akol. You burn everything of the oila. L'rabos, hatzamas, hagidim, hakanayim, hatlafim. All these items. Afilu parshu. Even if they were separated from the body, you burn them. Not like Rabbi. Hamoni b'kayim v'asisa l'secha basav adam. The pasuk says basav adam, which implies some things are not burnt. The answer is b'poikin. The Tanakama believes that the hooves, the horns, the sinews, you burn them on the mizbech even if they're separated. Basav adam. Basav adam just means that you burn them all in the mizbech even if they're separated. But let's say they shoot off the mizbech. The heat of the mizbech shoots them off. If they're meat or blood, you put them back. If it's the hoof, you don't have to put them back. But you have to burn it right away. Initially, you burn it. Comes Rabbi, and Rabbi says, no. Rabbi says, I have a riba and a miyat to tell me that that's not true. Kasav echarayim hiktar kodesh hakol. A riba, that's a riba. Kasav echarayim sila basav adam is a miyat. A ketzad mechubar yalu pirsha afil b'reisham mizbeach yerdu. So it's a machlekes tanoim whether you're obligated to burn the items, the hooves, the horns, the sinews, if they're detached from the animal. Tanakama says you burn them. Rabbi says you do not. The Gemara says v'Rabbanon, and according to the Rabbanon, who hold that you burn the sinews and the bones that's separated. Mechubar, what do they say? They say mechubar leitzakral rebuye. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that if they're connected. According to Rabbi, what is the pasuk chiddush? If they're connected, you burn it. If they're separated, you don't burn it. They would respond, if it's connected, it's pashut, you burn it. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that. It's like a part of the body. It's like the head. So it must be the pasuk is telling me that you burn it even when they're separated. Rabbi was the one who said, again, the pasuk says hakol, which implies something. That you burn, it's like a ribui. So Rabbi says it's to include these items if they're still connected to the animal. The Rabbanan say if it's still connected, it's pashut. It's to include even if they're disconnected. For Rabbi, and Rabbi who says that if they're disconnected, you don't burn them, and you only burn them if they're attached. Go to the next page. So Rabbi says, you're right. If the taka connected to the animal, it's pashut. So what is the pasuk coming to tell me? The chiddush is that you even burn the gin hanasha, meaning the ikar chiddush of the pasuk, according to Rabbi, if they're separate, you don't burn them. You only burn them if they're connected. And that's for the pasuk. Isn't it pashut that if they're connected, you burn them? So he's saying, yes, you're right. The fact that you burn the hooves, that's pretty pashut. If they're connected, the ikar chiddush is that you burn the gin hanasha. That even though Bnei Yisrael can't eat it, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu can eat it. The Rabbanon who respond, what do they say about the gin hanasha? So they take a hold, you're not allowed to burn the gin hanasha. And therefore the ikar pasuk is coming that if the hooves are separated, but taka if it's connected, it's pashut. And you're not allowed to burn the gin hanasha. Why? Mimashke Yisrael, min amusal Yisrael. You're only allowed to burn things that are kosher for the Jewish people. And therefore the gin hanasha is taka not allowed. So stop right here. This long brisa, what we've done is you have machlekes Rabbi the Rabbanon whether you're allowed to burn the gin hanasha of the oilo while it's attached to the thigh. For Rabbi, and how does Rabbi respond? The Rabbanon say you don't burn it because it's not kosher. How does Rabbi respond? Rabbi responds, you also burn on every carbon. You burn the blood, you burn the chaylev. That's never kosher for the Jewish people. So who said that the mizbeach has to only eat things that are kosher for the Jewish people, to exclude a gid? Rabbi, midi have a chaylev adam. Every carbon you pour the blood of the chaylev on the mizbeach. Jews can't eat chaylev or can't eat dam. And yet, it's brought as a carbon, so why can't you burn the gid hanasha as well? The Rabbanan, they say, no, mitzvahs b'kachshani. The Rabbanan say, you can't learn out from the dam and the chaylev. That's the ikar mitzvah. The gid hanasha doesn't have to be burned, and therefore, because it's not, in other words, those are the exceptions. The rule is it has to be kosher. Rav Huna says, gin hanasha shel oila, the gin hanasha of an oila, cholz l'tapuach. You go up to the top of the mizbeach, you remove it from the thigh, and you put it on the tapuach, was the giant mound of ash that it was in the middle of the mizbeach. Right? They would only remove the ash when it was like a lot, when it was overwhelming. There was always a giant mound of ash in the center of the mizbeach. You would put the gin hanasha in the ash. Rav Chizda says, Mari Dachi, Rabbi, miksiv al kein yoichal mizbeach, al kein yoichal b'nei Yisrael ksiv. He says, why can't I burn the gin hanasha? The Jewish people can't eat the gin hanasha, but Hashem can. Why do I have to burn it? Why do I have to remove it? Rav Huna responded, Mimashke Yisrael min amusar Yisrael. And Rav Huna says, because the pasuk says, Mimashke Yisrael min amusar Yisrael, you're only allowed to burn things that are kosher for the Jewish people, so the gid is not burnt. Meis ve'avakasha. According to Rav Huda, what do? You go to the top of the Mizbeach, you remove the Gin Anasha, and you put it in the ash heap. The problem is the Brisa says like this: Gin Anasha shel Shlomim. What do you do with the Gin Anasha of Shlomim? You see, the Shlomim is not burnt entirely on the Mizbeach, so you're definitely not bringing the Gin Anasha to the top of the Mizbeach. The Kohen can't eat it. So what do? You basically sweep it into the canal that runs by the floor of the Beis HaMikdash, and it gets washed away. B'shel oila, but what do you do with the oila? So Rav Huna says you bring it to the top of the mizbeach, you throw it into the trash in the ash heap. What does the Brisa say? Ma'aleyu, you bring it on top of the mizbeach. Stop. It doesn't say what you do with it. Ma'alav ma'aleyu maktiru. Doesn't that imply that you bring it to the top of the mizbeach and then burn it? So you see, it's not like Rav Huna. According to Rav Huna, you don't burn it. You just bring it to the top of the mizbeach and remove it. But this Brisa says ma'aleyu. Doesn't ma'aleyu mean you burn it? The Gemara says lo. Ma'aleyu v'choltzei. No. Ma'aleyu just means you go to the top of the mizbech. You bring it to the top of the mizbech, and then you remove it from the top of the mizbech. You don't burn it. In other words, you don't remove it when it's not on the top of the mizbech. You don't remove it like a hachana. You go to the top of the mizbech with the thigh, remove it on the top of the mizbech, and then put it in the ash heap. So says the Gemara, well, if you're going to remove it anyway, why not remove it before you go to the top of the mizbech? Why do you have to remove it after the top of the mizbech? Because means you always want to serve Hashem what you would serve to a chashiv a person. Bringing up a large thigh of an animal, that's very chashiv. Cutting up the thigh before you go up to the mizbech, that's like a bizayon. And therefore, you bring up the whole thigh, and then you start, on the top of the mizbech, you start removing the sinews of the Gin Anasha. You don't remove it before, because then you bring up to Hashem like sliced meat. We don't do that. Tani Kavas Rav Huda, we've embraced the backs of Rav Huda. The Brisa says, "Gin Anasha shel Shlom b'chabdei l'Rabba, the shel Rava, the shel Oila choltz l'tapuach, mamish like Rav Huda." Now that we mentioned the ash heap, Tanat Hasam, the Mishnah says, the Mishnah Talmud, Tapuach hayam emtza mizbeach. This ash mound was in the middle of the mizbeach. Pa'amim haya olav shalosh meyas kur, and at times there were 300 kur of ashes on it. Now that's a tremendous amount of ash. The Gemara is going to point out that's a bit of an exaggeration. That's 600. The article brings out it's 675 cubic amas. That would be massive, like a ton. Amar Rava Guzma. Rava says that Brisa is an exaggeration. It doesn't actually mean that amount of ash. It's just an exaggeration to show how much ash there was. The Gemara is going to give other examples of exaggerations. The Mishnah says before they would bring the carbon tumah, they would give it to drink. And they don't want the animal to be dehydrated. That way you can remove the hide better. So it says in the Mishnah, Hishkos hatamid b'kaishel zav. They would let the tamid lamb drink from a golden cup. Amarava guzma. That's an exaggeration. It doesn't have to be a golden cup. They could use a glass cup. A copper cup is also fine. Amaravami dibra Torah lashon haboy. Rabbi says there are examples throughout Mishnayos of the Torah speaking in hyperbole, exaggeration. Divrei Nevi'im lashon haboy. We have examples of Navi, also exaggeration. Divrei Chachamim. We have examples of Shas. Divrei lashon haboy hadamer. Well, the examples of Shas is what we just said. The mound being 300 amas, 300 kur. Divrei Torah lashon haboy. The example of the Torah being exaggeration because there's arim gedolos ubetzuris b'shamayim. The pasuk says how the when it's describing with the Meraglim, it says they saw cities that were fortified in Shemayim. Now, obviously, cities were not in Shemayim. It just shows how strong and how large they were. In Nevi'im dichsiv tibka haaretz b'koilim, the pasuk says that when they coronated Shlomo, it said the ground split, like it sounded like an earthquake. Obviously, it wasn't an actual earthquake. It just shows you how it's in a shikol guzma. We have three examples of Mishnayos where it seems to be exaggeration. Eluhain, Tapuach, Gefen, and Proiches. Now, Tapuach, as we said, there was the mound. There was too much. It was more ash than described. That it was describing a large amount of ash. Gefen, regarding the grapevine, is the Tanan. The Mishnah says, Gefen shel zav haisei medes al pischa shel heichel. The entrance of the heichel had this golden grapevine, which was suspended on poles. And people would donate a golden grape or a golden cluster of grapes, and they would hang it on there. That was like the donation spot. And that's not the exaggeration. They once had to move the grapevine, and they needed 300 kahanim to move it. It was that heavy. That's an exaggeration. If you need 300 kahanim to move it, that means that it would snap based on its weight. So that's an exaggeration. And Pareiches, Titanan, Rishim Galil, Rishim Ben Aksgan. Pareiches Uvia Tefach. The Pareiches separating the Kodesh HaKadoshim and the Heichal was a thick of a tefach. Well, Shibrishnayim Nirim Neregis, it had 72 woven threads. Well, Kolnima Venima Esim V'Arba Chutin, and each thread was made up of 24 sub-threads, strands. Orcha Arboim Amma, its length was 40 amas. V'Rachba Esim Amma, and its width was 20 amas. U'Mishmoinim V'Shtei Riba Nesses, it was made 820,000 threads. Shtayim Oisa B'Shana, and 2 were made each year, because I guess they would wear out. The Shalosh Veis Kahanim Atbilan Oisa, and they would dip it in the mikvah. They would need 300 kahanim to dip it. Now that's an exaggeration. You don't need 300 people, so it's yet another example of, again, a guzma. I will stop here and pick it up tomorrow.